Me live from New York is Professor of State University of New York Maritime College and political commentator Mark Meirowitz. Mark, I want to thank you for joining us today. I know you've been listening to, you were listening just now to Erdogan's speech, and I'm certain, knowing you so well, that you've been following the elections throughout today. What is, just as a general overview, what is your impression of what you've seen from Turkey today?
The most important impression, Andy, is that it appears that it's a fair election, and that's very important. And I think that makes a big impression on the world. There have been, people watching ballot boxes, and everybody's doing that. So at the end of the day, the world sees that Turkey ran a fair election, and that's really important. Also, it's the will of the people, and that's very important. And it looks like we're going to have a runoff. And I think that if you say a takeaway, I think it's an absolutely fascinating election in every respect, and trying to deconstruct it is very interesting. One important takeaway, if we go to a runoff, is the parliamentary result, which has been very well explained on the network. It would appear that the alliance of the AK Party, MHP, and one smaller party, the People's Alliance, has gotten enough votes so that it could, in effect, stymie or prevent a number of the proposals that the Nations Alliance Chair and Kılıçdaroğlu have proposed. They proposed going back to parliamentary system. In order to do that, they would need a sufficient number of votes in the parliament. And I don't believe they would have that based on the numbers that we're seeing, the numbers of where the People's Alliance and what they've received in the parliament. So when we get now to the runoff, what it looks like it's likely, there's a lot of shifting gears here and a lot more focus on the proposals of the Nations Alliance as against where the People's Alliance is, in terms of actually, it looks like, controlling the Grand National Assembly. That will be very, very significant, I think, in the minds of Turkish voters.
That's a very interesting point that you're bringing up now. That even if Kılıçdaroğlu were to become president of Turkey, that much of his ability to govern is reduced by the makeup of parliament. A very interesting point.
Yes, and I think that the other point is that it's not only that, but also the impression of the fact, the significance that the People's Alliance looks like that group has a control, a majority of the Grand National Assembly of Turkish Parliament. I think that has a lot of meaning going into the presidential election, because maybe Turkish voters are thinking, well, we have the same problem here in the United States. We end up having one party in the legislature and another party in the presidency, and then nobody can do anything and nobody can get anything accomplished. I think the other thing that's going to be very interesting now is how the gears are going to shift in terms of this coalition that makes up the Nations Alliance. That's going to be very interesting. I mean, is that alliance going to stick together? Is it going to where are we going in the next 2 weeks in terms of that alliance? And what about Sinan Oğan? He's a factor. He's a 5% factor here. How is that going to play out? So it looks like there are a number of advantages for the People's Alliance going into the presidential election if there is a runoff. Again, as you said before a number of times, and as I think the president said, we're not sure what the results are, but it looks like that nobody got that 50% plus one.
Yes,
so we're probably going to find off.
There are still some votes to be counted, but the calculus doesn't look likely that a final result will occur, although anything is still possible. Again, interesting points you raised there about the Nation Alliance, made up of 6 parties plus one. Maybe you saw, whilst President Erdogan was speaking, maybe people didn't understand. Somebody was holding up a placard that had 6 + 1 = 0, which was a statement about the Nations Alliance, the 6 parties round the table plus the HDP, which is known to be supportive of the terrorist PKK organization, and the person holding that placard making the statement that that's an ineffective union. And of course, maybe you'd like to comment on the spectrum of political views that are brought together within the coalition. It's almost, maybe that would be one reason why people weren't able to find themselves able to vote for Kılıçdaroğlu today, because they didn't believe that his coalition would be able to hold together into the future.
Well, you know, coalitions historically for Turkey have not been successful. In general, coalitions are not very successful. I mean, you know, you have the same problem in Israel and many other parliamentary states. The coalitions stick together. They have a glue. And their glue right now, this coalition, you say the six, and I gather the head of party as well, that what you're looking at is the glue that keeps them together is essentially a proposition to President Erdogan becoming president. So the question is, and you know that coalition is a very frail coalition, because we recollect that it wasn't very long ago that Meirowitz, which is a very important element of the coalition with some real clout.
The leader of the E party.
The E party, which has a nice number of seats, very important player, actually dropped out of the coalition and then had to be cajoled in a way to come back into it. Again, the glue being, we're going to get together and we're going to oust the president. Well, that's an interesting strategy. Clearly, they didn't win, majority in the parliament, number one. And number two is, what happens if, in fact, the alliance, the Nations Alliance, wins the election? If they do, then all the coalition members, and I think this is historically in Turkey when the same sort of thing has happened, coalition members, it happens in Israel and India, all these countries, all the coalition members are now starting to jockey for power. And it's very interesting that I think it was Kılıçdaroğlu there was a whole issue. What happens if we win? Who gets, special attention, and I guess in terms of portfolios and things like that. And I think Kılıçdaroğlu said every one of the table of six is going to be equal. Meaning even the parties, there are a couple of very small parties here. And by the way, and I think as you intimated, they run the gamut from left to right, up and down. They're very, very wide disparity. Well, when they get in office, is that true that the leadership of that coalition will accord those parties with almost no influence, equal influence in the portfolios and the ministerial positions? Is that likely? Hard to know. I mean, promises. We have a Broadway show like that in New York. Promises. Well, you can make all the promises you want, but how do you fulfill them? And in the coalition, it's unlikely. And we know in coalition governments, there is a tremendous fight for jockeying for that position. And I think that is the kind of the contrast between the AK party and Erdogan as a leader of the party, and he does have the People's Alliance, and that's raising an interesting question in terms of the MHP and MHP, which did very well in the elections, about their influence and so forth. But the leadership, there's a president as incumbent, as against Kılıçdaroğlu and his table of six, where the table of six is a table that is not necessarily clearly united in terms of governing. Yeah, they're certainly in terms of their strategy and to oppose and to oust the president. But other than that, what's their strategy? They're so disparate in their philosophy and in their ideas that how is that going to gel together if they do take power? And secondly, won't they be fighting for influence, especially E party, which has really important clout in the coalition? Are they going to say, oh, it's okay for those smaller parties to be equal to us? Very hard to know. Also, you have some very, very, very strong personalities in that coalition. So as I said, you have a coalition on one side, which now did not succeed in obtaining the majority, and doesn't look that way in the parliament. Many of the things, as we said before, the things that alliance, the Nations Alliance, wanted to do hinged on that. If they don't have that and they're going into the national election, it looks like that undercuts, as you said very well, a very key policy.
I think there are two key words that you've just used that maybe explain an awful lot about the current situation. One of those words is leader, and the other is personality. On the one side, the People's Alliance have a very strong leader. Who also has a great personality, but they have a very strong leader. The People's Alliance under President Erdogan have a very clear goal, a very clear focus. Its alliance partner, the MHP, hasn't tried to take any of the limelight. They've worked together to build their coalition and their way forward together. And on the other hand, the Nations Alliance has a lot of strong personalities, like Meirowitz, like and others. I hesitate to say like Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, because one of his, it seems one of his main experiences has been one of losing elections against Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and it seems surprising that they didn't find a leader. They gathered together personalities, the mayoral candidates, including Istanbul's İmamoğlu. Yes, as personalities they have popularity, but in terms of leadership, there's not one person who's really at the helm that's really respected to take things forward. And that I imagine is a big problem in politics, isn't it?
Well, no, I think you do have strong personalities in that coalition. You do have, Ahmet Davutoğlu, former foreign minister, Ali Babacan, who was a former finance minister. These are very strong personalities, but they're not the leader, as you pointed out, of the coalition. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is the leader of it. Now, it is also a question of kind of direction for the country. I mean, that's really the question. I mean, Kılıçdaroğlu comes with his policies, his ideas, his approach, and his background as a bureaucrat in government, and his ideas of what he wants to put forward. It would appear that those ideas and that, based on these results, did not result in what we would call in America a slam dunk victory. On the contrary, the parliamentary vote appears that people, I think, looked at the coalition, looked at the problems in terms of the mixture here of these parties, and didn't accept the idea that they wanted a coalition like that they wanted the AK party and MHP to govern in the parliament, and maybe even as an idea as a counter in terms to even if Kılıçdaroğlu had won on the first round. So that's a very important, I think, sense. But at the same time, Kılıçdaroğlu also presented in his ideas something of an approach in terms of foreign relations. We really didn't talk about that, but that is an important factor as well. At least, certainly an important factor, and I think this is the important point. I'd like to make it straight away. Who's looking and analyzing the elections? Well, I'm reading the New York Times. I'm reading the Western Press. I'm reading all of the Western American analysts, and they're looking at this from the point of view, which is perfectly fine, of the American interests, the European interests, and so forth. But it's the Turkish people who went to vote today.
Mark, I have to stop you. The Supreme Election Council President is speaking.
And the other parties. Yes, friends. 2:25. The data are being entered still.
Sorry, there was just a very brief interlude there with the Supreme Election Council President saying that the data is still being updated and the results are still being prepared. Still with me from New York is Mark Meirowitz. And Mark, you just brought on to actually a very important point that that we need to talk about, which is we talked to the two. Well, there were four names on the presidential ballot, but we'll focus on the two main names: Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, were the main focus for the presidential elections, both here in Turkey and, as you say, in the media around the world. And in talking generally about the coalition, the Nation Alliance earlier, you said it was we're going to get together and oust the president coalition. The media around the world also has taken a very similar stance. We're going to get together and oust the president. If you look at much of the press from outside Turkey, not just from the United States, from France, from the UK, The Economist last week making some rather disgusting remarks on its cover, it's been very anti-Erdogan. Why?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to extend that point, if I may, a little bit. In other words, the point is that, you know, if you want to analyze, it's perfectly fine to analyze election, but why not look at the voters and what they're thinking and put yourself into the Turkish mind and the Turkish thinking and the thinking of the voters. I mean, that's very hard to do, by the way, because we never know why people vote. We have the same problem in American elections. And why did you vote? Well, great person. I really like this person. And you know what? It isn't always policy. It's also how you feel about the candidate. Now here, in terms of Turkey, with the very, very difficult problems it's facing, the question is, what are the Turkish people thinking? And I think the way you phrase it, I think, is very, very interesting, because it's not just the media, but it's also analysts around the world. I think, and of course it's their right to do that. And, we have, freedom to say what you want, and that's the American way. But the point is, they're coming to this with a certain predilection, a bias, if you will, about who they want and who they don't want. And I think that definitely, if you read that material, as you mentioned, The Economist, by the way, The Economist, I have to say, is a great magazine, but it really gives very strong opinions, as you say. And if you read it, and that's how you're going to understand this, you're not going to get the full story, because you need to understand why do the Turkish voters today actually vote the way they did, which in effect gave a majority to the People's Alliance in the Grand National Assembly and go for a runoff. I mean, gee whiz, there are two ballots here. So, I always look at the people. What do the people feel? What are the people thinking? And I am interested in what the American and Western media are thinking, but what they're thinking about is often has a certain element, as you say, of criticism, and perhaps some of those criticisms are valid, and they have the right to express those criticisms, but that doesn't get you into, I don't think, the Turkish mind, the Turkish thinking. And I can come up with my own idea too, and I'm an American academic, and I can come up with an idea, but to me, the key to this election, I guess the way I feel about it, is what you said was leadership, but not just leadership, but the role of Turkey in the world. With all the problems that Turkey has, Turkey really is a global and regional player in the world at this time. In fact, if you look at the Ukraine war, you see there something I think is pretty amazing, extraordinary, call it what you want. I mean, you have Turkey actually providing support and weaponry to Ukraine at the same time as it has relations with Russia and doesn't support sanctions. I mean, you can, scratch your head till tomorrow and understand how you can do that. And also to mediate the bringing of the grain out of Ukraine that was needed in Africa and other parts of the world, and to be a mediator. All of these things, I think, indicated to this idea, and if I may use this idea of Turkish pride or şerefet, that Turks feel that they are a player in the world stage. And I believe that with the problems in the region, that's very important too, for Turkey to be able to have the clout and influence to actually be able to deal with these events that are occurring all around them. You know, I have a Turkish friend who said to me once, Mark, you know, Turkey, we live in a tough neighborhood, and that's true. And living in a tough neighborhood requires a policy, foreign policy, a way in which to project influence and power. And again, the West may be critical, the West may not agree. That's another discussion as well. But the question is, if you're having elections and they're free and fair elections, which we assume is the case, then it's the Turkish people who have to decide, what is my main concern? Now, Turkey has had some very big issues and very big problems. Economy, the earthquake, all these things. But it looks like the way the Turkish voter went to vote, and it is split in a way too. But again, at the end of the day, the result is there. If that is the result, we don't have the final result. But if that's the result, then it shows that the voters have spoken. And we have to listen to that in a way, maybe more so than we're listening to The Economist and the New York Times, which has a certain approach to this, which is, I mean, as far as the Times, and not to talk out of school, but their approach is fairly consistent when it applies to Turkey and other subjects as well. And so taking that into account, taking everything into account, we're looking at the election. What do the voters think? Well, this is what the voters came up with. And on the 28th of May, the voters, if there's a runoff, are going to come up with what is going to be the final answer.
And what will be interesting to see is whether the press around the world takes its lesson by looking at what has been happening here today in Turkey and adjusts their approach. You're quite right that there is the freedom of speech and that is right and good and proper, but there's also the need for respect, and respect of the 88% of the eligible Turkish voters who turned out today to place their votes in their free and fair election. Mark, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and excellent analysis. And we still wait with bated breath to learn the results, and if required, we'll look forward to seeing what happens again in 2 weeks. No doubt we'll be speaking in the coming days about how things are developing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I look forward to it and wish you all the best. Thank you.
Now, speaking at the party.